Folks, welcome to Eugene, Oregon. This is a special edition of the Jake Feinberg Show, and joined today by an American music and just an icon in general, Mason Williams. Welcome to the Jake Feinberg Show.
All right, thanks, Jake.
How did you, when did you first meet Steve Martin?
Let's see. Well, I used to play a lot of folk clubs in LA, the Ice House and the Troubadour, and Steve's had an act that was part music and part comedy. He played the five-string banjo, but he was a comedian. And back in those days, when at the Ice House, for example, if the star was a comedian, then they'd have a comedy act on first,
right,
and then a music act on second, and then a comedy act on third. And if it was a music star, then they would do the other way. They'd have they'd reverse that process, and so
Steve was dual. He could do both.
Well, he was I think primarily a comedy star, and one of the things that I hired Steve to write for the Smothers Brothers show, and one of the things I used to do is I'd go out to the Ice House, and Russ Jaguar, who's a member of the association, I don't know if you know that or not, but he was the light man, and I would sit in the light booth and watch the same act do 3 shows a night for 5 or 6 days in a row. So I probably saw Steve Martin perform his act 15 times in some week, and then in other cases as well. And it was there that I began to realize that he was on to something that was unique. And Tommy Smothers was looking for writers for the Smothers Brothers show, and he asked me if I knew anybody that I thought would be a good writer. And I said, well, there's this one guy that I work with out at the Ice House and the Troubadour that's pretty interesting. He plays the 5-string banjo, which is kind of funny to start with. And he's got a unique sense of humor, and he does unusual takes on, like one of the things I liked was that he would read all of his bad reviews about himself for the audience.
That was part of his gig. I love it.
Right, and so I talked Tommy into hiring Steve as a writer on the summer show in 1967, the one that Glenn Campbell was the host of, and he hired several other people that were, Rob Reiner was someone he hired, and Lorenzo Music, who was Carlton the doorman, he was a writer on there, and it was me and my partner Alan Bly. We were the head writers for the show, and
But Steve, I just want to be clear,
Bob Einstein, who just passed away, unfortunately.
Bob Einstein.
Yeah, he was a writer on the show, and Tommy was very hip about hiring. He said, I want to hire people that will become writers by virtue of the experience they've had, and so he was very good about the way he educated the writers to what it was all about.
Can you riff on that a little bit more, the experience that they had? Was it an organic experience?
No. One of the things that Tommy would do that was unique was if somebody wrote a comedy piece, he would do it just the way they wrote it. And if it wasn't very good, then it was obvious to everybody at the rehearsal who saw it. And he used to say, it doesn't do you any good as a writer if you write a piece and I take it away from you, or the head writer does and changes everything without you knowing why it was changed. So we wanted you to see that what you wrote, where it was good and where it wasn't, and therefore next time you write one, it'll be better. So he was very supportive of the creative process. And the first piece Steve wrote, he showed it to me, and I gave him some critiques on it. It was kind of long, and I said, the whole thing about television is that everything is compressed, so you got to cut this down to fewer lines. And
was network TV less compressed at that time, though?
with
In terms of content, I mean, weren't you able to tell longer stories at that time? I guess with comedy, maybe not.
let's see. Well, the Smothers Brothers were unique in that they were doing material from their acts, from their concert on the road and their records, and so they had a backlog of material that they could just do on stage. But I wrote a lot of material for them, and probably more than anybody else, because I had actually been on the road with them and backed them up. I played 5-string banjo and guitar and 12-string guitar and even recorder, which I used to play.
Wow.
Backing them up in Vegas and whatnot. And one of the great experiences I had was that I would, after they'd do a show, they'd come in the dressing room and talk about why a certain piece did work or didn't work. And I was listening to all of this, so I got a first-hand knowledge of how they put their show together. And
what were some of the things that you learned in your own onstage presentation from them, like in those talks backstage about how to be a leader on the bandstand?
Oh, on the bandstand.
Because you weren't. You wrote, but you weren't a stand-up.
No, I wasn't I didn't start performing really until about 1968. I did my first show, and I was busy writing this show, and Nancy Ames and I were writing songs together, and I did a concert with her, but I didn't get into performing until 69 later. But what you really learn is the idea that you want to have comedy material at the first part of your act because it sort of breaks the ice and
loosens people up.
It loosens them. And you learn, the first thing you do is just to get everybody accustomed to each other, and then you want to humor in the next two or three songs at least, and you want a lot of comedy patter between songs if you can, and you play parodies. I wrote a lot of parodies. Most of the time when they had parodies on the Smothers Brothers show, my partner Alan Bly and I would write them, and I went on to write a lot of parodies for my Christmas show, for example, and so that was. I will say this about the Smothers Brothers. I remember Tommy said to me, when you write for us, don't write jokes. He said, we don't do jokes. It's our relationship that's funny. And so what we want is a kind of a beginning and a middle and an end where we can improvise in between. And so you would set up premises, and I had learned about 300 folk songs when I was in college, and so a lot of the material that I gave them were folk songs that I knew, and I would say, hey, here's a folk song, and you and Dick can sing it, or Dick can sing it, and you're going to interrupt it for whatever reason, and
work to their relationship.
Yeah, and get into their sibling rivalry arguments about what the song was about. I even wrote a piece for them called "You Didn't Come In," and it was a piece where they started singing a song, and Dick suddenly can't remember the lyrics, and Tommy says, "Hey, you didn't even learn the whole song because you knew I was going to interrupt it and mess it up for you." So they got into a whole argument about the fact that he was living off of the fat of the land was a phrase back then, the fat of your stupid brother, So anyway, I think my best observation about them really was that I thought of their comedy act as a magical act. And when I say that, a magic act is not just the tricks and the illusions, but there's a magician. And I said, well, in one sense, Tommy is the magic, but Dick is the magician. Because a magic act needs a guide to take you through the tricks. The tricks by themselves wouldn't be as entertaining, and actually it wouldn't work very well. And you could apply that to other people on television. Stephen Colbert, when he has guests, he's the magician, and his acts are the magic. And he can also be the magic himself when he's funny with his monologues at the beginning. But I think that that's the nature of a lot of comedy acts, is that there is a magician and then there's the magic. You can apply it to almost Ellen DeGeneres. Almost anybody, could be the magician and also the magic.
They can be one and the same, or they can be two people, or right.
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't have to be
right.
They can be one and the same, or two. Here, you told me in our radio interview about Ken Kesey said that most people can be clever, but it takes something to be magical. You want to be magical, okay? Can you talk about the first time you met Ken Kesey?
Well, Ken, I had a place up in Oak Ridge, which is about 50 miles from here, headed toward Klamath Falls up the highway, and Ken lived in Pleasant Hill, which is just a short distance from here. And of course, I knew about him from his books and had read his books. And I found out where he lived. And one day I stopped by just to introduce myself. And we sat in front of his house, and he had a parrot that was chewing wood off the side of the house in front of us. And we
it's customary for parrots to do that.
And we had a swig of whiskey, a couple of swigs between us, and I just talked to him about the fact that in my river show that I was doing, I said, my problem is that since I play guitar and it's mic'd, I'm sort of stuck behind a microphone, and what I need is somebody who could be more like an actor, someone who could, be on stage and move around, have some motion to it, and that there are comedy bits that I could engineer for you to do that would, because he told me, he said that he wanted to be an actor more than a writer.
He went to Hollywood. It didn't work out.
Yeah,
that's right.
And but he used to act on paper.
Absolutely.
When he wrote, one of the things I heard was that he had this big room upstairs, and that his kids, Zane and
Sunshine.
Yeah, they told me.
And Jed Kesey.
Right.
Yeah.
He said you'd hear him upstairs talking to himself. It sounded like, but he was being these characters that he was writing about, and he was thinking of what they might say to each other, but actually moving around up there and kind of acting out what ended up being on paper.
I did it. Oh, that's great.
But
so you needed him to be, like you said, almost an actor.
Right.
But did you give him? Did you want to write the script for him?
I would write ideas for him, but then I would say, okay, this is the same way I wrote for the Smothers Brothers. Here's a structure, a beginning, middle, and end, and you can improvise in the middle of it any way you want to. And we worked really well on that. I wrote one piece called "Shall We Gather at the River," that I wrote the beginning of it, and it was about the idea that this was in my river show, and I said, and it was historical. And when I got to the hymns part of it, we sang "Shall We Gather at the River," and I said, Ken, I want you to be a preacher. And I said, and I'm going to call you Ken, for God's sake, Kesey. And so he came out, and he used my lines as a structure, but then he had some great lines of his own that he added, and that was ideally the same way I wrote for the Smothers Brothers, is that you would give them a structure and a beginning, middle, and end, and they could improvise in the middle of it.
I mean, can you talk about, okay, so he accepted that offer. He was into it, and then the idea. How many rehearsals did you do, and how much of it was just really off the cuff?
Let's see.
I mean, Art Maddox was doing a lot of the writing, the musical writing too.
He was doing the arranging, yeah, and a lot of it was it. I was the front man, and I sang and played guitar and did the intros, and the arrangements could. I had a 13-piece band in that show. In other words, it was me playing guitar. I had a bass and a drummer and Art, but I also had a woodwind player, Tom Bergeron, and he played all the woodwinds. He was great at sax, but he played clarinet.
I feel like I know that guy. Yeah.
He's really a great jazz player. And then I had a banjo player, a 5-string banjo player, George Rellis, and a mandolin player, John Averill, and a fiddler named Hollis Taylor, who not only played fiddle, but played classical violin. So I could put together any arrangement you wanted. So if you wanted a kind of and a cello player.
Wow.
I had every kind of band you could conceive of. It was a bluegrass band, a folk band, a jazz band, a classical orchestra, a pop band. I mean,
you could write any arrangement for any kind.
Anything at all. Yeah, it didn't really matter.
Wow.
And eventually, I put this all together and did it with a symphony here in Eugene, and I also played one with the Sacramento Symphony with the orchestra. I should have done more of those, but I only did a couple. But it really worked well, and the concept of this show was, well, we started with the water music in 1717 and came right on up through Talking Heads, and it was great for me to be able to do Talking Heads, and you went through all these various styles.
But I mean, the idea is that you say, I want you to be a preacher, there'd be no script. He would do, that would be all him.
Well, no, there was a script because he would learn what I wrote, but then enlarge on it.
Right. Was that his magic? Was that the magic?
Well, excuse me. I guess you can edit that out, right? The magic in that show was the fact that it was not only entertaining, but it was historical, and it was about a lot of times it was played to save rivers from being exploited with dams and whatnot, and it was very effective. I did a show in the San Francisco area that stopped the city. Part of a campaign, it stopped the city from putting a garbage dump on a little river that ran, called the American River, that ran right through this community. And
wait, that was the cause of the concert, or that
the what?
Like it was a benefit concert for that, to prevent.
Yeah, it was a benefit for that and to raise awareness and it.
Wow.
We played a concert in Bend, Oregon, that stopped them from stopped 16 dams from being put on the Deschutes River, and so it had its moments. We did 60 concerts, and I would say about a third of them were for river conservation programs, either to make awareness or raise money for them, and about a third of them were entertaining, and another third was educational, because we'd play for high schools and colleges and educational meetings and whatnot. So of all the things I've done, I thought the magic was that it had this depth. And it was kind of like the Smiler's Brothers show. It wasn't just about being entertaining. It was about being socially relevant and about freedom of expression. So those are the things that you look for, was to have concerts that you do have more depth than just be you being the center of attention.
This is something that popped into my head today.
I'm sorry?
When was the first time that you played with a drummer?
With
a drummer?
A drummer. In the folk days, you didn't have drums.
But what were those clubs in Oklahoma City?
Yeah, they were mostly in Oklahoma City. A couple of them in L.A., but I didn't get in Texas. It didn't stray too far from that area, and I would say the first time I got involved with using a drummer was when I started recording in Hollywood, because you know, basically, if you were going to go out on the road, you were going to have to recreate your hit record.
That's right. The audience wanted to hear what they want right off the record.
Right on stage. And the first guy I worked with was Mike Cannon, and he was he wrote a song even that, Michael Jackson recorded.
That's
he
right.
was an excellent musician, but great drummer, and I had wonderful bass players, and Hal Blaine was my drummer there for a while. After Mike, Hal took over.
Did Hal go on the road with you?
Oh yeah.
Would Hal do stand-up comedy? Apparently, he was a comedian. He wanted to be a comedian too.
He was very funny on stage.
Yeah, David Grisman used to let him do stand-up for a while.
Right.
Yeah.
Hal, I've never met anybody that if you had to drive 500 miles from one gig to the next could tell you a different joke for 500 miles and never repeat himself. In fact, when Hal decided to quit going on the road, I said, Hal, I know you don't want to go on the road anymore, but we're sure going to miss all those great jokes. And he said, I'll tell you what, why don't you come on the road and just tell jokes? And I'll only charge you $1,000 a week. So, and I hear from him all the time. You know, he's going to be 90 next month.
90.
Yeah, and well, he was legendary, and so many recordings I did with him too.
When you first walked into your first recording session and you saw Larry Knechtel did you know they were going to be on the set? What was that feeling like when you saw you were working with basically the Wrecking Crew there?
I would say that the first really major recording session, I did demos of things like that, and I didn't always know who was going to show up, but Jimmy Gordon was the drummer on Classical Gas. He had a tragic end.
Yeah, he killed his mother.
Yeah.
I still need to go to the jail and do an interview with him.
And but Mike Post produced that first record, and it was a 37-piece orchestra, and we rehearsed, and then we did a take, and it was so good we kept the first take. But and it was a 4-track, you know, so the whole orchestra was on 4 tracks, and my one track was my classical guitar, and one was a 12-string that I overdubbed just so to give it more substance. Because sometimes the orchestra would just overwhelm the classical guitar, but I could bring up the 12-string and
amplify it.
Yeah, that really made it stronger. And first class players, Mike really knew everybody to call, and the great orchestra, all those wonderful.
Well, no, my question is, how was it recorded? Did they lay the rhythm tracks first and then you'd sing?
No, live, all of it.
With the strings, 36,
everything.
Hitting at one time.
Yeah, everything.
What are the keys to actually, I mean, was that Post's genius? Was that he was able to take basically a triple big band and...
Go what?
He was able to take a huge band and record that in a beautiful fashion. Because normally those, you'd break that up. You'd break up the rhythm section.
Well, that's now, but then back in those days, I mean, Frank Sinatra and all those records that Hal played on and whatnot, he said that was all live, you know. And Hal used to talk about his experiences with, like Frank Sinatra, when he was recording a song, he wouldn't sing it the first time, he would talk it through, just talk the lyric through, because he, you know, what's important is what you're saying, the meaning, and so you can get too singery in one sense if you get carried away with the melody and how well you sing and whatnot. But he was very happy because he said, you know, I'm communicating and I want it to be just like I'm talking to you, even though I am singing.
How do you think that helped the accompanist? Like, did that help Hal actually hit it when they did hit in the tune?
Well, he did that for his own, you know, Frank.
Sure, no, I think it's fantastic, but I'm just wondering if it impacted the musicians themselves.
I don't think so, because, you know, whether it was Nelson Riddle, he was on.
You worked with him.
Yeah, he was on the Smells Brothers show, and all those great arrangers that worked with Frank. Their charts, were rhythmic, and I think they were complete. And Frank is not interfering with the arrangements. He might say, I'd like it a little faster or a little slower, or I might want to slow this section down. They'd talk about that, but basically it was the arrangement that the arranger put together, and he was counting on all those great people he worked with, Billy May, you name it, and so I learned a lot of stories about Elvis and whatnot, and
how did your music change? Yeah, I mean, how did your music change when you added a rhythm section?
I would say that you started to write. When you're a folk singer, you're writing just for to accompany yourself and to sing it. And the first thing, I think the first instrument that you add is bass.
Yes.
Because even if you're a singer, you really sing to the bass as much as you do to your own playing.
Sometimes counterpoint.
Yeah, because the bass is making sense out of the structure of the piece for you. And when you add a drummer, you're really making rhythmic sense out of it. So I would say it was in demos and in concert that you began to realize that the drummer was essential to the structure of the piece and the energy level. I mean, that's the great thing about classical gas was the drums were so rock and roll in the bass. I remember telling Nelson Riddle, I said, "Gosh, Nelson, you wrote all this great music, but you unfortunately didn't have a rock drummer and a bass player." He said, "Yeah, music has certainly changed," and I said, "Yeah, that was the essence of it." And I think one of the things, the great things about classical gas was that it allowed someone like Mike Post to have a career, because up until that time you were a singer, and
right.
There was instrumental music. There's not anymore as hits, but it gave arrangers a chance to be. I used to say, classical gas gave arrangers a bin in the record shop when they sold records.
I'm telling you, man, they were getting credits as leaders. You had rhythm sections a little bit later on, being able to cut records as the rhythm section or as the section. There would be prolific studio cats that could develop identities. I think that's the point, is that in today's world,
oh yeah, well,
it's hard to develop an identity that is authentic today. There's a lot of pop stars that could not perform their act on live. They're not real musicians.
No, it's manufactured music, and
you couldn't get away with that back in the day.
No, and that was one of the things that I liked about the Smothers Brothers, was that Tommy used to say, when you come on the show, if possible, we want you to sing and play your hit live, because that's what the audience responds to, and you're playing to an audience, even though it's just in the theater, that will resonate for the viewer as well. Right. And he said, we'd rather have you actually play the music as opposed to sing to a sound, perform to a soundtrack. Sometimes you had to do the soundtrack because if it had staging production values, because of chords and mics and stuff, you couldn't do that. But that was one of the great things about Tommy, was that he wanted people to really do what they do on stage, on the show.
Mason, can you talk about the bluegrass scene in Southern California when you moved out there? I mean, you're on an anthology record with Eric Darling,
right?
With David Lindley. These are
These
were the world. Did you get into, for lack of a better word, cut sessions with those guys? I mean, did you have jam sessions with them?
No, David Lindley was kind of a folk banjo player back in those days.
He was.
And Eric Darling, I guess the big thing, the big break that I had was growing up, and when I was in Oklahoma City, I went to Oklahoma City University, and I worked in a record store.
What was the name of the record store?
The record shop, I think it was called. It's not there anymore,
Yeah.
but I actually listened to every record in the store, and I had a teacher. I told him that
Coltrane or Charlie Parker records, everything.
all of it.
Wow.
Every single record. I just the store would close at 9, and I would close up and stay in there until about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and just go down the rows of the albums and play each album, and just say, well, this is not too interesting to me, but it must be to somebody.
Right.
And so I listened to all of them, and I told a teacher, one of my teachers at the university, OCU, and I told him what I would do, and he said, well, that's really interesting because you're getting a musical education that nobody ever really gets a chance to have. And he said, do yourself a favor and go back and re-listen to the ones you weren't that crazy about. And that's when I began to appreciate Hindemith and all the classical composers, and I began to realize, well, harmonic ambiguity and dissonance is pretty interesting stuff. So,
but you also got hip to Lenny Bruce.
Yes. In this, one of the things that was interesting was that because of Oklahoma City being, the Air Force bases and different people from all over the country were living there, and had different tastes than basic Oklahoma City
Right.
listeners, and they would come into the record shop and do special orders, they were called, and it would be. I remember listening to Lenny Bruce in 1958 and Mort Saul and all these different Oscar Brand, the body ballads and all the. So there was a whole bunch of records that weren't mainstream that people knew about, and they would order them, but I would very carefully listen to them before I gave the record to them. And so I got a major education out of working at the record store.
Going back to those guys, though, I mean, the Banjo Cats, the
Oh yeah.
Did you cross paths with them along the way? I mean, you wound up on that anthology album. I forgot the name of the tune that it was.
Right. Well, I was.
I mean, was there a period of time that you were just a folkie?
I was just a folkie,
Yeah.
and I don't know. I don't remember who linked me up with it. It might have been my publisher, music publisher, and but somehow I got on that Liberty record. The 5-string banjo greats, it was called, or something like that.
That's right. It's remarkable. And I forget the name of the tune. It's
Yeah, and I played a couple of things on there. One of the weird things I did was that the 5-string banjo is basically not something you can modulate with because of the 5th string. It's it's either it's usually the 5th, but it can be the root. And so I said, okay, I'm going to go through 4 different keys if possible and record Whistle While You Work, the Walt Disney tune. And I don't know how successful it was, but it was the idea of being experimental. And because the thing about the 5-string is that it can be the tonic, it can be the 5th, could be the 4th, and it's hard for it to be depends on the key you're in, so I would move around, and if I was playing in the key of C, then that G became the 5th, or if I was playing in G, it became the tonic, or if I played in D, it became the 4th, so and you can even get away with the 2nd sometimes, depending on the tune, but it was the idea of being experimental, and I think I wouldn't have done that if I hadn't gone through music school and being interested in all those things that you learned in music school. You studied harmony and counterpoint, and
you were gigging 6 nights a week. At a certain point in your life, you were gig on the bandstand quite a bit.
Yeah, I played the banjo a lot in my folk shows, and it was great to change instruments because you had the classical, you had the 5-string banjo, you had the recorder, and you had the 12-string. So, and you're singing and playing, so you can go through a lot of different kinds of material.
When did Byron Berline enter your life?
Let's see. I met Byron. I played a hootenanny, it was called. And
Yeah, sure, I see those records. Howard Roberts, by the way, did you know Howard?
no.
He was on the same album. It's weird. There's a great story there, but I'm not gonna go back to Byron. When did you cross paths with him?
We played a hootenanny at the University of Oklahoma in Norman, and Byron was on the show, and boy, he was
Cooking.
He
like
was
Vassar.
an amazing player, and I was playing for a 12-string for a black gospel singer named Lorraine Parker was her name, and she sang gospel, and I played 12-string behind her. 12-string, she had a big voice, and 12-string was great because you could really get some more sound out of it. And play. I didn't play with a flat pick, but I played with finger picks, and so anyway,
You had it was you driving the rhythm on that.
yeah.
Just you and her. There was no bass, no upright bass or anything like that.
I'm sorry.
There was no upright bass.
No,
It was just you and her.
Just me and her.
So he played the same bill though. Byron was on that bill.
Yeah, and it was. There were other folk singers. It was a hootenanny. It was a kind of a cross section of people there in Oklahoma, and some people came through. Who's the woman that played the mouth bow? I can't remember her name, but she was on the bill. But anyway, I was so impressed with Byron's playing that after we quit, we went out in the parking lot and talked and got to be friends and became close friends from then on. And I played about 150 shows with Byron over the years, and 50 of them were with symphonies because I like the idea of putting together a bluegrassical gas or symphonic
Bluegrassical gas.
Yeah.
What do you get off? Explain how you merge those two.
It was the idea of having a pop band and featuring bluegrass players, and so I'd have to play classical gas, and I'd have to play some of the Smothers Brothers theme and other things that I was noted for. But I thought it was interesting to have the bluegrass be the energy for the orchestra, and so the orchestra would, it wasn't so much that the orchestra was fiddling, because I left that up to the fiddlers, but the orchestra was playing programmatic music, background music. So if you picked, sometimes they played Byron's lines, depending on what they were, but generally the up-tempo center.
Right, they were not. Was it connected to the?
No, because how do you write for French horns and trombones and bluegrass? And it took a while to figure out how to do that. And
Did you do that yourself, or did you have?
I tried it in the beginning, but I wasn't very good at it, and I eventually started relying on people like Art in particular who could write for orchestra. Because boy, it's a talent that I don't possess to figure it out. Although I do have some ideas sometimes about lines, that I hear, but I'm not exactly sure what instrument to put them in. Are they French horn, flute, or what are they? And string writing is really the essence of most of what you do with the orchestra, and so you've got to really know what you're doing to orchestrate that. And I bet I have 200 pieces or something like that for different bands and orchestra. I don't know what to do with all this stuff. I don't know where to archive it.
Well, if anybody out there wants, maybe they can reach out and collaborate. But no, I was going to say the we talked last time about them, the Smothers Brothers, letting Pete Seeger on the broadcast.
Right, yeah.
But you also said that they brought on a lot of black acts. So it was Ray Charles, Sam Cooke. Which black artists were featured on the Smothers Brothers?
Let's see, Nancy Wilson, I do remember.
Rest in peace.
She was really great. And Moms Mabley was on the show. I'd have to look back at, we had a couple of black choirs. One of them came all the way from Chicago to be on the show, and it was like
Sanctified.
25 or 30 people, and Tom flew them all out and put them up in a hotel, and they sang on 2 numbers on the show. And so there were a lot of a lot of all kinds of people on the show. One of the things that I thought Tommy did that was interesting was he would say, when you come on our show, everybody wants you to do your hit, which they would do if it was a group or a singer. He said, but we want you to also do something that isn't your hit that you're interested in. Maybe it's your new thing. Maybe it's something that is part of your act. So I thought that was great, is that he gave them the freedom to not just do what was kind of required of them, but also what they wanted to do.
For those in 50 years that are going to be watching this, you spent your time back and forth between Oklahoma City and Oregon.
Right.
When I came down here, Mr. Doan told me that your 2nd grade teacher was the same teacher as Ken Kesey.
My 8th grade teacher.
8th grade teacher.
Yeah, was Ken's 7th grade teacher. Mrs. Dugan, Alice Dugan was her name. And she was one of the hippest people that I've ever known. Oh, she just understood how to encourage the interests of people. Like, for example, she told me, she said, when I was teaching Ken in the 7th grade in Springfield, he was a little bit rowdy in class. And I said, okay, Ken, if you want to be rowdy, then we're going to put you to work being rowdy, and you're going to put a show together for the students. So shut up and get busy. So she knew exactly.
Tapping right into his natural skills.
Right.
But what is the legacy of Oregon, this sort of pioneering spirit that you can talk to peeps that are going to be seeing this well after we're gone?
Let's see, this goes back to something interesting. When I was, this was in the early 60s, but I saw this a program, and it was about Native Americans, and it was, there was a graphic, and it was a circle, and it was called the Circle of Life. And the Native Americans said, on the circle of life, there's the sun, the moon, the stars, the mountains, the forests, the deserts, the animals, the birds, the bees, the insects, and people. So people were part of that circle of life. And then they had another drawing that said, on the white man's circle of life, the white man is at the center of the circle, not on the circle. And so that for the white man, everything revolves around him. Whereas the Native Americans said, we're part of everything. We're not the center of it. We're just part of it. So when I came back to Oregon, I thought, this is a chance to explore that philosophy, and that in Oregon, you're part of the community. In Hollywood, you're struggling to be the center of activity, but in Oregon, you were part of things. That's why my river show works so well, because I'm involved in saving or keeping rivers from being exploited. I'm involved in my Christmas shows, which were community oriented, and my bluegrass band was kind of that's parking lot music, you might say. So
they play in a barn in front of 5 people with 3 teeth,
Right, yeah. And So, and I didn't really put much effort onto my pop career after I left Hollywood. It was mostly these other things. And one of the things that I like about Oregon is that when you're part of things, you're kind of taken for granted because everything here is so.
It's part of this. It's part of the circle.
Part of that circle, right? You're not the center of it. You're part of that circle of life,
Wow.
and you're kind of taken for granted, which I think is the ultimate compliment in one sense, is to be part of that circle.
You're not out of the ordinary.
No, yeah, and you're glad to be part of the community, glad to be part of the wilderness, glad to be part of the everything that's here. And Oregon, I have to say, is really unique from what all it has to offer.
One final question for you, Mason. How did you learn to get out of your own way?
Well, I read a lot of philosophy books, and
Was there a point in your career where your ego was in the way, like you couldn't get out of your own way? And was there a demarcation point at any point when,
I would say
outside of things you learned in books, like experiential stuff?
I would say that when I was in Hollywood, you kind of burn out on trying to have a career.
Right.
And I decided, okay, I don't want a career, I want a creative life. And a creative life is where you, some water, here we go.
Thank you.
Here's a thing that Oregon's all about. Well, a creative life
It's
is...
the cycle, man. It's the circle.
Right.
The circle.
Yeah. A creative life is, I even wrote a joke about it. I say, a creative life has an agenda. I mean, a career has an agenda.
Okay.
A creative life has a veranda. So, while you're on the phone with your career, I'm out on the veranda looking at the stars and the sky and this and that. So, and you draw inspiration from the agenda, of course, because you've got to create things to keep that going. But you also can have a creative life where a lot of people paint just because they like to paint, not because they want to have a career as a painter. And so, in one sense, I think that my creative life really came from being here in Oregon and just embracing local things that were going on. People used to say to me, how do I break into Hollywood? And I said, well, the first thing you do is you write for things that are going on locally. Do concerts here in town. Write songs to play with your friends. Write plays that your friends might do, or put on shows that are locally oriented, because eventually you're going to go to Hollywood or wherever, New York City, you name it, and shop these ideas, but you're going to really create them here. I mean, in one sense, Hollywood is more of a marketplace for things, but places like Oregon and Washington and all over the country, they're actually more creative in one sense, because things are emanating from local interests.
Would you say the veranda approach has added longevity to your life cycle on this planet?
Yeah, I would say so.
The inspiration carries you?
Yeah, because you're not writing for the hit parade, you're writing for your friends, and you're writing for your community, and you're writing for a broader context of interests. And not that you can't do those. I could go back to, I could write, I could still write comedy for, there aren't any variety shows on to speak of anymore, but in one sense, they became the talk shows. And
Yeah, that's right.
the variety show was really important to me because it was music, it was comedy, it was acting, because we had a lot of actors on the show, and you had to figure out roles for actors. What do they do? How does Betty Davis, what does she do on a variety show? Lana Turner, I got to write for her. I mean, all these fabulous people you'd seen in these movies, but here they were. And one of the things I liked about Tommy was that he liked the idea of putting older stars on the show because he would watch TV with his grandfather, who was older, and when older artists that his grandfather was familiar with would come on, his grandfather would light up and really get excited. But he didn't know who all these young people were. And
Right.
so Tommy started putting older people on the show just to make his grandfather happy. Why not have a personal interest as inspiration?
Before I came over here, Art Maddox said, the spirit of Kesey is, Ken Kesey is still very much alive inside him. And I just wanted you to give a shout out to your old friend Ken Kesey and what would be your, he's looking down on us right now. So what's the message to him?
I would say that of the two people I met in my life that I thought were great men were Pete Seeger and Ken Kesey.
Oh man.
And I think it's because not only were they clever and could write great songs and great books on it, but they were able to embrace all of humanity, warts and all, I guess you might say. And Ken was, all kinds of people would come by his place and stay and visit and talk, and they were welcome. And Pete Seeger was always trying to improve the welfare of the common man, you might say. And so I think it was that broad love of humanity that Ken and Pete Seeger and those are the off the top of my head.
Well,
the two that I
it's
remember the most.
inclusivity and it's for all mankind.
Yeah,
Right.
And
Warts and all.
right, and that Ken was. Pete Seeger was always peace oriented. I don't know if you've seen it or not, but there's footage of him standing out in the snow on a street corner, talking about and singing songs about peace and whatnot. And Ken was always.
Well, the pranksters, Babs or George Walker told me they would disarm. There'd be these huge anti-war movements
Right.
versus very patriotic people pro-war Vietnam War. Those guys would disarm them with dentine gum.
Uh-huh.
And a speech.
Right.
So.
Well, that was the idea of you don't want to just be clever, you want to be effective.
Magical. You said magical.
Yeah.
And just for the record, Mason Williams never went to any communist meetings. That was Pete Seeger to find out what they were actually accusing him of being, which he was not.
Oh yeah. No, what I said was that Pete told me, he said I went to meetings to find out about him, but it got crossed up as I went, but I didn't.
No, just we're correcting that for the record. And Mason Williams, we'll do it again, man. It was such an honor, man.
All right, enjoyed it, and it's always fun to talk about.
It's about promotion. It's not about preservation. It's about promotion, so people know how real art is made. So thank you, brother.
Yeah, my pleasure. Okay.
The Jake Feinberg Show. We'll see you later.